The bills are stacked high, spilling over the sides of the wheelbarrow. Not neatly, not in crisp bundles, but shoved in, crammed together, a mountain of paper that trembles with every bump in the cobbled street. It's October 1923, and I'm pushing it through the frantic, freezing streets of Wedding, my neighborhood in Berlin. My hands ache, my shoulders burn, but I can't stop. The crowd pushes past me, a blur of gray coats and desperate faces, everyone moving with the same frantic urgency. This isn't just paper. This is my day's wage, and it's dying in my hands, losing value with every single breath I take. My name is Johann Schmidt. I'm 43 years old, a machinist by trade. I work at the metalworks factory, crafting parts with a precision I'm proud of. Or at least, I used to be. Today, my real job is this: getting this absurd pile of Papiermark to the baker before it becomes completely worthless. If I'm lucky, it'll buy 2 loaves of bread for my family. 2 loaves for an entire day of my skilled labor. You might be wondering, how does a man's honest work turn into this? A literal wheelbarrow of cash for a bit of bread? Trust me, I was asking the same question every single day. The numbers had grown so large, they'd lost all meaning. Just last week, a loaf was hundreds of millions of marks. Today, I didn't even want to think about it. The factory paid us twice a day now, sometimes even 3 times, because the money melted away so fast. We'd be given our wages, and then it was a foot race, a mad dash, to spend it before the next price hike, sometimes just hours later. The air bites at my exposed ears, thin and sharp. Winter is coming, and there's no coal to be found, not at any price I could ever afford. My breath plumes out in front of me, joining the collective sigh of the city. Berlin is a city of ghosts these days, haunted by the shadow of the war we lost, by the crushing burden of reparations, and now by this invisible, silent killer, hyperinflation. A child, no older than my Carl, stands by a doorway, tears leaving clean streaks down a grimy face. His mother holds his hand, her eyes hollow. He's looking at a discarded newspaper, not reading it, just staring, perhaps dreaming of using it as kindling. My stomach clenches. My own children, Liesel and Carl, are waiting at home. They're hungry. They're always hungry. That thought is the only thing that keeps me moving, keeps me pushing this absurd, heavy burden through the throngs. The sheer bulk of the money is a spectacle, a public humiliation. People glance, some with pity, some with a bitter, knowing smirk. They're all in the same boat, after all. Someone jostles my wheelbarrow, nearly sending a cascade of bills onto the street. I clench my teeth, tighten my grip. Losing even a handful of these now worthless notes could mean the difference between a meal and a night of gnawing hunger for my family. I turn the corner onto our main street, Neue Schönhauser Straße. The bakery, Herr Schmidt's, is just ahead. There's a line already, of course, always a line. It snakes out the door, everyone clutching their bundles, their bags, their own small carts of paper. The desperation is thick in the air, a silent, shared understanding. No one speaks much. What is there to say? I find my place at the back, leaning against the cold brick wall, trying to catch my breath. The wheelbarrow sits in front of me, a monument to the insanity. My hands are red and raw from the cold and the friction. I pull my worn gloves higher. Liesel had patched them just last week. She's 15 now and far too thin. Carl, my 9-year-old boy, tries to be brave, but I see the way his eyes linger on the empty space where food used to be. The line inches forward. Each person emerging from the bakery looks defeated, their small purchase clutched tight, their faces grim. The smell of fresh bread, usually so comforting, now feels like a cruel taunt. It's a luxury, a fleeting moment of sustenance bought with a lifetime of trust, of savings, of stability, all burned away. Finally, I'm inside. The warmth is a relief, but the scene is chaotic. People are shouting, pleading. The baker, a kindly old man, usually so jovial, looks utterly worn out. His apron is dusted with flour, his eyes are red-rimmed. He has a piece of chalk in his hand, standing by a large blackboard behind the counter. And as I watch, he slowly, wearily erases the price for a loaf of rye bread. My heart thumps. I know what's coming. He writes a new number. Slow, deliberate strokes. It's a number I can barely comprehend. Billions. Hundreds of billions. He writes it, and then steps back, his shoulders slumped. The new price for a single loaf of bread. I push my wheelbarrow forward, my turn. My throat is dry. All those hours at the factory, the sweat, the ache in my bones, the precision of my craft. It all comes down to this. This desperate, humiliating race against the clock. This mountain of paper. I look at the new price on the board. My mind struggles to register the zeros. It's 670 million marks for one loaf. I push the wheelbarrow up to the counter, my arms trembling. Herr Schmidt looks at my overflowing paper, then at me. His eyes are full of apology. 2 loaves, Herr Schmidt, I manage to say. My voice is hoarse. He nods, his gaze falling to the wheelbarrow, then back to my face. The unspoken question hangs in the air between us. Did I even have enough? Was all my work, all my frantic effort, truly worth even 2 loaves of bread anymore? But before all that, before the wheelbarrows and the billions, before the frantic dashes and the gnawing hunger, there was a time when money simply worked, a time when a day's honest labor bought more than a single loaf of bread. It was early 1922. My hands, calloused then as now, worked with the same precision at the metalworks factory, each gear, each component crafted to perfection. I was a skilled machinist, after all. My weekly wage was about 200 marks. Not a fortune, no, but it was enough. Enough to keep our small 3-room apartment in Wedding warm. Enough to keep Greta's pantry stocked. Enough to ensure Liesel and Carl had shoes on their feet, even if they were always a size too small. Life then, you see, it was predictable. You worked your 48 hours a week. You earned your wages. You paid your rent, about 50 marks a month for our place. You bought bread from Herr Schmidt's bakery for maybe 4 marks a loaf. Milk was 2 marks a liter. And at the end of the week, if Greta was particularly clever with her budgeting, we might even have a mark or 2 left over to put into the little ceramic jar on the shelf. That jar, that was for their future. Liesel's dowry, maybe. Carl's apprenticeship. Dreams, small and fragile, but real. I remember those evenings. The smell of Greta's simple cooking, usually potato and cabbage stew, filling our apartment. The warm glow of the gas lamp. Liesel, already a young woman at 14, helping her mother mend our worn clothes, her nimble fingers stitching new patches onto my work gloves. Carl, 9 years old, carefully drawing soldiers with his stubby pencil, humming a tune from school. We would eat together, talk about our day. Simple pleasures. We had survived the Great War. I hadn't been on the front lines for long, too old for most of it, but I'd worked in a munitions factory, seen the relentless churn of machines building the tools of destruction. We lost 1 million men, lost territory, yes, but the fighting was over. The guns were silent. We were rebuilding. Slowly. It was a heavy burden, the reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles, but my neighbors and I, we believed we would work our way through it. Germany was strong. Germans were industrious. That was the belief. And our mark, our currency, it felt solid. You put it in the bank. It stayed there. It held its value. You could plan. You could save. You could trust. It's hard to imagine now, isn't it? That feeling of trust in something as simple as a coin or a banknote. You probably don't think about it much today. When money works, you just use it. It's part of the background, a silent promise. But when that promise breaks, well, you saw what happens. Even then, in early 1922, there were murmurs. Prices had started to creep up. Not drastically, not like a stampede, more like a slow, unsettling tide. A loaf of bread that was 4 marks might become 4.5, then maybe 5. Milk might be a few pfennigs more. We'd complain, of course, over a beer at the local tavern. The government printing money to pay reparations, someone would grumble. It's going to ruin us. But it was mostly talk, a familiar grievance. My wages, they adjusted too, slowly, grudgingly. It felt like a balancing act, a struggle, but a manageable one. We were accustomed to struggle after the war. Greta, ever the pragmatist, would stretch every pfennig. She knew how to make a single chicken last 3 meals, how to turn stale bread into a hearty soup. She'd sigh sometimes, looking at the market prices, wondering aloud if we could afford a new dress for Liesel's confirmation or a proper toy for Carl's birthday. "It's getting harder, Johann," she'd say, and I'd reassure her. "It's just temporary, Greta. A bit of post-war turbulence. It will settle down." I truly believed it. We all did. I remember thinking about my father. He'd always drilled into me the importance of thrift, of a good day's work, of saving for a rainy day. He'd lived through lean times, too. And I, Johann Schmidt, was following his example. I was providing. I was building. I was saving. I was a man who understood the value of things, of effort, of a stable mark. Looking back, it's almost funny how naive we were, how much we clung to the idea of normal. We saw the cracks, sure, but we just kept patching them, believing the foundation was sound. We had no idea the entire house was about to collapse, that the very fabric of our lives, woven with hard work and modest savings, was about to unravel into a pile of worthless paper. We were just living our lives, trying to make ends meet, completely unaware that the real price of peace and the war that preceded it was about to be paid. Not in gold, but in the slow, agonizing death of our daily bread. The slow, unsettling tide I mentioned at the end of 1922, that subtle creep of prices, the whispers of money printing. Well, it wasn't a tide at all. It was a dam slowly cracking, and January 1923 was when the first serious breach appeared. The waters began to rush in. It started with the Ruhr. You see, after the war, the Treaty of Versailles demanded impossible reparations from us. France and Belgium, tired of waiting for their payments, decided to take matters into their own hands. On January 11th, they marched troops into the Ruhr Valley, our industrial heartland. They said they'd take what was owed to them directly from our mines and factories. The news hit Berlin like a thunderclap. At the factory, the mood was grim, but also defiant. We were Germans. We wouldn't stand for it. Our government, in a move they called passive resistance, told the workers in the Ruhr to strike. "Don't cooperate," they said. "Don't produce a single lump of coal for the invaders." And to keep those workers and their families fed, the government promised to keep paying them, even though they weren't working. Now, you might be thinking, how do you pay millions of striking workers when your country is already struggling with war debt and reparations? Well, the answer was simple, and in hindsight, terrifyingly obvious. You print the money. You print it faster and in larger quantities than ever before. At first, there was a strange sort of unity in it, a feeling that we were all in this together, resisting the injustice. We talked about it over our lunch breaks at the factory, our voices low, full of a mix of anger and patriotic pride. "They couldn't break us," someone would say. "We'll show them." Then came the first of many wage adjustments. My pay went up. Not by a little, but by a substantial amount. I remember bringing home my wage packet that week, feeling a genuine surge of relief. "See, Greta?" I told her. "I told you it would settle down. The government is taking care of us." Liesel and Karl, hearing the news, even seemed to stand a little taller. For a brief moment, it felt like a victory, a small personal triumph in the face of national humiliation. That feeling lasted until I walked with Greta to the market 2 days later. "Johann," she said, her voice tight, pointing to the price board at Herr Schmidt's bakery. "The bread, it's jumped again. And the milk." The loaf that had been around 4 marks just a year ago now cost nearly 170. Milk, which had been 2 marks, was now almost 100. My new, higher wages? They were already shrinking, evaporating before our eyes. That small surge of relief I'd felt a few days earlier turned to a cold knot in my stomach. It was like running up a down escalator. We were moving, but we weren't getting anywhere. Greta, ever practical, was the first to truly grasp the scale of it. She managed the household budget with the precision of a master artisan. Every pfennig accounted for. Now she'd spend hours poring over her accounts, her brow furrowed, a faint line of worry etched between her eyes. "Karl needs his milk, Johann," she'd say, her voice quieter than usual. "But it's twice what it was last month. My old sewing machine, I could sell it, but for how much? And what would that buy us next week?" I'd try to reassure her, of course. "It's just the Ruhr, Greta. Once they pull out, once things settle, it will stabilize. It has to." I told myself that as much as her. We had to believe it. To think otherwise, well, that was too frightening to contemplate. We had our savings jar, remember? The one for Liesel's dowry. For Karl's apprenticeship. It still held a modest sum, growing slowly, but it was there, a symbol of our future. I clung to that. But the reassurances felt hollow, even to me. The news from the Ruhr was relentless, and the stories from the market, they were worse. People talked about the printing presses at the Reichsbank running around the clock, belching out stacks of money. More money, always more. Now, looking back, I understand the simple, brutal arithmetic. The government was printing billions of marks every single day to pay those striking workers. Billions upon billions. But there wasn't a single extra loaf of bread, or a liter of milk, or a pair of shoes being produced. There were still the same goods in the shops, if not fewer, because our industrial heartland was occupied. Imagine it like this. You have a small pool of water, and everyone has a cup. Each cup gets a fair share. Now imagine someone starts dumping buckets and buckets of water into that pool, but the size of the cups stays the same. The water in your cup, it just gets less valuable, diluted by all the new water. That's what was happening to our money. More marks chasing the same goods just meant each mark was worth less and less. It was a simple equation, though I didn't fully grasp it then, not in its terrifying entirety. All I knew was that my hard-earned marks, the ones I earned with the sweat of my brow and the skill of my hands, were slipping through my fingers like sand. And the speed of that slip was accelerating. That winter, the chill in the air wasn't just from the weather. It was a cold dread, settling into the bones of Berlin. The hope of stability, the quiet pride in our rebuilding Germany, it was all beginning to fray. We hadn't seen the worst of it, not yet. But the cracks in the dam were widening, and the trickle of uncertainty was becoming a roar. We were about to learn that the price of passive resistance was going to be paid by every single mark in our pockets, every single pfennig in our savings, and every single meal on our tables. We just didn't know how high that price would go. The cold dread I felt in January, the one that settled into the bones of Berlin, it didn't dissipate with the spring thaw. It just intensified, becoming a constant low hum beneath the surface of everything. The trickle of uncertainty from the Ruhr became a torrent, sweeping away the last vestiges of normalcy. By mid-1923, by the time summer was upon us, the economic landscape had changed so profoundly it was almost unrecognizable. The price of bread, which had been around 250 marks in January, now climbed to hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Not over months, but over weeks, sometimes over days. Every morning Greta would come back from the market with a fresh line of worry etched deeper into her forehead. She'd tell me the milk was no longer 100 marks, but maybe on 2,000 marks. A small piece of meat, a luxury we barely indulged in anymore, could cost for 1,000 fornsu. The government, still clinging to its passive resistance in the Ruhr, kept the printing presses at the Reichsmark churning. Faster, always faster. I heard rumors that they were running 24 hours a day, the machinery groaning under the strain. It was like a desperate race against a clock no one could see. Every new bill they printed, every fresh stack of money that left the mint, just pushed the value of the old money further down. It was a vicious cycle, a dizzying descent. Then came the change at the factory. It was a Tuesday, I remember. We gathered for our usual weekly payday, but the foreman, Herr Richter, looked grim. He informed us that from now on, we would be paid daily. Our wages, he explained, were losing value too quickly to wait an entire week. We had to spend it immediately. My first daily payday was chaos. The factory gates opened, and a crowd of men, usually orderly and tired, erupted into a frantic rush, everyone clutching their envelopes, jostling, pushing. We poured onto the streets like a burst dam, all heading in the same direction. The markets, the bakeries, anywhere we could offload this rapidly depreciating paper. I remember the sheer panic of it. My envelope, usually thin, was now a fat wad of bills. It felt substantial in my hand, but I knew its bulk was a lie. I had to get to Herr Schmidt's bakery, to the butcher, to the grocer, before the prices changed again. And they would change. I saw the signs being scribbled over, new numbers appearing almost hourly. It was a race against a phantom. The streets of Wedding, usually bustling but manageable, became a daily spectacle of desperation. Men and women, their faces tight with anxiety, carried bundles of cash in their pockets, in small bags, some even in briefcases. Everyone moving with a frantic, determined energy. There was a strange kind of unspoken understanding among us. We were all in the same boat, rowing furiously against a current that threatened to drag us under. The embarrassment of it was a bitter pill to swallow. I, Johann Schmidt, a skilled machinist, a proud provider, was now reduced to this. Rushing through the streets, my pockets stuffed with bills that felt like a child's play money, knowing that every minute I delayed, my family's next meal was slipping further away. What kind of a man couldn't hold on to his earnings for more than a few hours? At home, the impact was crushing. Our meals grew simpler, more meager. Meat became a rare memory, replaced by potatoes and turnips, stretched thin with cheap flour. Greta would work miracles with what she could find, but the hunger in Liesel's and Karl's eyes was harder and harder to ignore. Karl, my brave little boy, would sometimes ask, his voice small, why we couldn't have butter anymore, or a proper slice of sausage. I'd tell him it was just a difficult time, that it would get better. But the words tasted like ash. Greta, my steadfast Greta, she bore the heaviest burden. She'd spend hours at the market, haggling, pleading, trying to stretch our daily wage. She saw the prices change right before her eyes, watched shopkeepers erase and rewrite numbers with a weary sigh. She'd come home exhausted, her spirit diminished, the weight of the market heavy on her shoulders. It was during those frantic dashes, those daily sprints to spend my wages, that the true nature of it began to sink in. Money, the paper marks, they weren't wealth. They were just paper. The real wealth was the bread, the milk, the coal, the shoes, the tangible things, the things that nourished us, kept us warm, clothed us. The government could print all the money they wanted, but if there wasn't enough bread to go around, all that paper was just kindling. It was a revelation, stark and brutal. I thought about our savings jar, the one for Liesel's dowry, for Karl's apprenticeship. It still sat on the shelf, filled with what I thought was a decent sum. But the numbers in the bank, the numbers on my banknotes, they were becoming meaningless. I saw it happen to my neighbor, Herr Gruber, a retired railway man. He had saved diligently his entire life, a modest pension, a small nest egg. He came home one day from the bank, his face ashen, clutching a handful of notes that, a few months prior, would have bought him a small house. Now, they wouldn't even buy him a single meal. His life's work gone, just like that. The anger was a hot, bitter taste in my mouth. Anger at the government, at the French, at this unseen force that was stealing our lives, our future, one worthless mark at a time. But beneath the anger was a deeper, colder fear. A fear for my children, for Greta, for what would happen when even the frantic daily dash wasn't enough. We were running, but the ground beneath us was crumbling away faster and faster, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that we hadn't hit bottom yet. Not by a long shot. The fear I felt in summer, the anger that burned in my throat, it was nothing compared to the madness that gripped Berlin by October and November of 1923. The daily dash had become a daily sprint against a hurricane. Prices didn't just climb anymore, they rocketed, not just by the hour, but by the minute. It wasn't just money dying. It was reason, sanity itself. A loaf of bread, which had cost hundreds of thousands of marks in July, was now hundreds of millions. Then, impossibly, billions. The numbers grew so vast they became meaningless. You couldn't even count them fast enough. It was like living in a dream, a nightmare where the ground kept shifting beneath your feet. My daily wage, which had been paid weekly, then daily, was now often paid twice a day, sometimes 3 times. We'd clock out at noon, get a stack of bills, sprint to the shops, then clock back in for the afternoon shift, knowing that by the time the evening payment came, the morning's money would already be worth half as much. It was a cruel, exhausting charade. This was the time of the wheelbarrow. The image I opened with, the one of me pushing a mountain of paper through the streets of Wedding. That was a daily reality for many of us. Not just me. You'd see children pushing their own small carts, housewives with laundry baskets overflowing with banknotes. The money itself became a burden. It weighed you down, physically. My hands, already rough from the metalworks, were red and raw from the friction of the wheelbarrow handles, from the cold, from the sheer effort of pushing that worthless paper. One afternoon, I remember, I finally reached Herr Schmidt's bakery on Müllerstrasse, my wheelbarrow threatening to spill its contents with every bump. The queue was longer than usual, snaking around the block. I stood there, shivering, the cold seeping into my bones. When I finally got inside, my breath pluming in the warmth, the usual blackboard was there, but the price for bread was being changed by the baker himself. He was erasing so fast, his chalk barely keeping up. I asked Herr Schmidt the price of bread, my voice hoarse. He looked at me, his eyes tired, full of an apology he didn't need to voice. It had been 5 billion marks this morning, he told me, gesturing to the board where he was writing the new number. Now, he said, it was 6.7 billion. For one loaf. I stood there, panting, the numbers ringing in my ears. 6.7 billion. For a single loaf. I had just enough for 2. Just enough. All that work, all that struggle, all that humiliation for 2 loaves. I felt a surge of something hot and bitter rising in my chest. It wasn't just frustration. It was an impotent rage. I wanted to scream, to pound my fists on the counter. But what good would it do? Herr Schmidt was just trying to survive too. "Fine," I managed, my voice tight. I pushed my wheelbarrow closer, already counting out the impossible stack of notes. "2," I told him. At home, the children were always hungry. Liesel, my usually cheerful Liesel, was now 15, and her once bright eyes held a constant, watchful anxiety. Her shoes, which had been patched and repatched, finally gave out. The soles flapped loose, her toes showing through the worn leather. I looked at them, then at my daily wage, a literal mountain of paper, and knew it wasn't enough for new ones, not even close. What kind of a father couldn't buy his daughter a pair of shoes? And Carl, my little boy, he stopped asking for butter or sausage. Now, he just asked, his small voice barely a whisper. "Papa, why am I always hungry?" What could I say? That the government was printing money to pay striking workers? That the French were occupying our factories? That the mark was worthless? How do you explain the absurd to a 9-year-old? I'd just hold him close, stroke his thin hair, and promise him that tomorrow we'd find something. Always tomorrow. Greta, my strong, practical Greta, she was slowly fading. Her meticulous budgeting had given way to quiet despair. I'd see her sitting at the kitchen table long after the children were asleep, staring at the empty cupboards, at the small, dwindling pile of our family heirlooms. Her mother's silver locket, a small porcelain figurine her grandmother had cherished. She knew we might have to part with them. But for what? How long would a single heirloom buy us food when the prices changed every hour? The breakdown of order wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the streets. I saw it one day near the market. A small crowd had gathered around a delivery cart, piled high with potatoes. People were shouting, pushing. Then, a sudden surge. A man grabbed a sack, another wrestled with the driver. It wasn't a riot, not really, more like a desperate, chaotic scramble. But it was a stark glimpse into the abyss. The veneer of civilization, it was thin, terribly thin, when hunger gnawed at your gut. People were desperate, and desperation, I learned, could turn good people into something unrecognizable. The moral dilemmas were everywhere. Whispers of the black market were no longer whispers, but open invitations. You could find almost anything there, real butter, a bit of meat, even a sack of coal, but at prices that would make your head spin, and always, always with the risk of arrest. I considered it. I truly did. My family was hungry. Liesel needed shoes. What was a man to do? Obey the law and watch his children starve, or break it and give them a chance? The line between right and wrong blurred into an agonizing gray. I was exhausted. Profoundly, utterly exhausted. The physical toll of the daily rush, the mental strain of constantly recalculating, the emotional burden of seeing my family suffer. I would return home from the factory, my muscles aching, my head pounding, and fall into bed, only to lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rumbling of my own stomach and the occasional whimper from Carl's room. Was this it? Was this the end of everything we had worked for? The end of our modest life, of our family's future? My father's lessons about thrift, about saving, they felt like a cruel joke now. Every mark I'd ever saved, every pfennig put aside for a rainy day, had evaporated into thin air. I had nothing left to give, no more tricks up my sleeve, just the sheer bone-deep weariness of pushing that wheelbarrow day after day, week after week, against an enemy I couldn't fight, couldn't even see. I didn't know how much longer we could endure. The exhaustion, the rage, the gnawing fear that had gripped me in those weeks of billions, it brought me to my knees. But it didn't keep me there. You see, when everything you believed in, everything you worked for, is stripped away, you find out what you're truly made of. My father's lessons about thrift, about saving, they were worthless in the face of a dying Mark. But his lessons about hard work, about ingenuity, about providing for your family no matter what, those lessons, they suddenly became the only currency that mattered. The money, the papier mark, was dead. It was a fact. You couldn't buy anything with it, not reliably. The government was still printing, but it was like trying to fill a sieve. The only things that held value were real things: food, fuel, clothes, and the skills of your own hands. I was a skilled machinist. My hands, calloused and strong, could repair almost anything. I knew the inner workings of engines, the delicate balance of gears, the precision required to make a machine sing. That, I realized, was still worth something, more than a wheelbarrow of paper. One morning, after another fruitless dash with my wheelbarrow, I saw a farmer from the outskirts of Wedding in the market. He looked as desperate as the rest of us. His small delivery cart had a broken wheel. A simple repair for me. I approached him, my heart thumping, a new kind of negotiation forming in my mind. I told him I could fix it quickly, efficiently. He looked at me with suspicion, then at my empty hands, then back at the broken wheel. What did I want in return? I told him, a sack of potatoes, enough to last my family a few days. He hesitated, then nodded. It was a gamble for both of us, but within an hour the wheel was fixed, spinning freely. He looked at it, then at me. He didn't have a sack, he said, but he would bring me some. He brought me a small bag that evening, not a full sack, but enough for 2 days. It was the first time in weeks I'd felt a sense of honest transaction, of real value exchanged. It was a small victory, but it felt like a mountain had been lifted from my chest. My skill, my craft, still had meaning. Greta, too, found her own strength. The quiet despair that had settled over her gave way to a fierce determination. She looked at her mother's silver locket, then at me. We had talked about it, the painful necessity. She knew we couldn't eat silver. She approached Frau Müller, our neighbor from downstairs, who had a small, carefully hoarded store of flour, enough for a few loaves of real bread. Greta offered her mother's locket. It was a beautiful piece, intricate German silver, a family heirloom for generations. Frau Müller, seeing the desperation in Greta's eyes and knowing the value of such a piece, agreed. The locket for a sack of flour and a small piece of cured sausage. The trade was made, a transaction born of necessity, not profit. Greta came home, her eyes red, but with the flour clutched to her chest. We ate real bread that night. It tasted like sorrow and survival. And the community, the people of Wedding, we started to look out for each other. Not everyone, no. There was still the desperation, the occasional scramble for food I'd witnessed. But mostly, we were in it together. Old Herr Gruber, the retired railway man whose savings had been wiped out, he had a small garden. He couldn't work it much anymore, but he'd let Karl help him, and in return, he'd share a few carrots or turnips. Frau Schmidt, the baker's wife, she'd sometimes set aside the crusts for children who looked particularly thin, not for money, but for a nod, a silent understanding. At the factory, things also shifted. The management, seeing that their papiermark wages were utterly meaningless, came up with a new system. They started paying us partly in what they called Notgeld, emergency money issued by the factory itself, backed by the factory's own goods and reserves, and partly they paid us in kind, a few lumps of coal from the factory stores, a small amount of grain they'd managed to barter for, sometimes even a pair of rough work boots. It wasn't much, but it was tangible. It was real. It meant we wouldn't freeze, and Liesel might finally get some new shoes. even if they were heavy, ugly factory boots. Liesel, my clever Liesel, she became a master of make do and mend. She learned to unpick old sweaters, reknitting the yarn into scarves, or patching Carl's thin trousers. She even managed to fashion new soles for her old shoes using scraps of tough leather I brought home from the factory. Her 15-year-old hands, usually meant for embroidery or school books, now worked with a grim determination. And Carl, he stopped asking, "Why am I always hungry?" Instead, he'd ask, "Papa, what can I do to help?" He'd go out looking for scraps of wood, anything that would burn in our small stove, his spirit unbroken, his young eyes bright with purpose. There were moments, even in the depths of that madness, when we found a strange kind of humor. The absurdity of it all. I remember seeing a man in the street trying to light his pipe with a 1,000,000,000 mark banknote, and the laughter that erupted from the small crowd around him wasn't cruel. It was a desperate, shared release. What else could you do but laugh when your entire world had turned into a joke? The black market was still there, a constant temptation. But I found myself less drawn to it. My hands, my skills, our community, that was our black market. Trading labor for food, heirlooms for flour. It felt honest, even if it was born of desperation. It was a way to survive without losing ourselves, without succumbing to the lawlessness that threatened to consume everything. We were surviving. Barely. The hunger was still there, a dull ache that never truly left. The cold of the coming winter was still a menace, but we were fighting. We were adapting. We were learning to live in a world where money meant nothing, and ingenuity meant everything. It was a brutal lesson, one etched into our very bones. But it was a lesson that also showed me the strength of my family, the resilience of my neighbors, and the enduring value of a man's own hands. We might have lost our savings, our stability, our faith in the mark. But we hadn't lost our will to live. Not yet. We were still breathing, still striving, still looking for tomorrow. But what kind of tomorrow would it be? That we still didn't know. The sheer will to survive, the ingenuity of bartering and sharing. It carried us through the blackest months of 1923. But even the strongest will can only hold out for so long against a broken world. We were still hungry, still cold, still exhausted. We were alive, yes, but living on the edge of a knife every single day. And then, just when it felt like we couldn't take another breath, another frantic dash, something shifted. The ground stopped crumbling. It was November 1923. The rumors started circulating, quiet at first, then louder, like a distant train approaching. A new currency, a stable currency. The government, they said, was finally going to act. We'd heard such promises before, of course. My neighbors and I would scoff, shake our heads, too weary to believe. How could you trust money again, after what we'd seen, after what we'd lived? But this time it was different. On November 15th, it became real. The Rentenmark. I remember the day the news was officially announced at the factory. Herr Richter, the foreman, called us all together. He stood on a crate, his voice uncharacteristically firm. The new currency, he explained, would be backed by real value, by land, by industrial assets. One Rentenmark would be worth 1 trillion Papiermarks, one single Rentenmark, equal to all those wheelbarrows of paper I'd pushed through the streets. A stunned silence fell over the factory floor. Then, a ripple of murmurs. Disbelief, mostly. Fear. Could it be true? Could this nightmare truly be over? My mind struggled to comprehend the scale of it. 1 trillion. It was a number too vast to grasp. All I knew was the quiet, desperate hope that bloomed in my chest, fragile and hesitant, like the first green shoots after a long winter. The first payday with the Rentenmark was unlike anything I'd experienced in months. No frantic rush, no wheelbarrow, We received a small, crisp banknote, a single Rentenmark. It was a strange, almost alien feeling to hold money that felt solid, real. I walked to Herr Schmidt's bakery on Millerstrasse, my heart still thumping, but this time with a different kind of anxiety. Would it work? Would he accept it? He did. I bought a loaf of bread, a full, generous loaf, with a single Rentenmark. It was the most expensive loaf of bread I'd ever bought, in a way, costing all the hope and trust we'd lost. But it was 1 mark, not billions, not trillions, just 1. And I walked home, carrying that loaf, feeling a kind of lightness I hadn't known in years. The immediate relief was immense. The daily scramble ended, the prices stabilized. Slowly, uncertainly, the markets began to function again. You could buy something, and its price wouldn't double by the time you reached the counter. You could hold a banknote, and it wouldn't feel like a ticking bomb, melting away in your palm. But with that relief came the reckoning. The immense, crushing weight of what we had lost. Our savings jar, the one I'd filled with such pride, for Liesel's dowry, for Karl's apprenticeship. All the papier marks in it were now utterly, completely worthless. A small pile of paper, fit only for kindling. It was a stark, brutal reminder of years of thrift, of sacrifice, all wiped away. I remember Greta sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she held a stack of those old papier marks. 1,000 mark note, 100,000, 1,000,000. Bills that once represented security, a future. Now they were just paper. She wept, quiet, exhausted tears, not for the paper itself, but for the dreams that had been folded into each one. The new dress for Liesel, the proper toy for Karl, the small comforts we'd always hoped for. All gone. Lost to the invisible fire of hyperinflation. Looking back now, I understand what happened. The war, the crushing burden of reparations, the French occupation of the Ruhr, each decision, each external pressure forced the government's hand. They printed money to pay the striking workers, to keep the country from outright collapse. But the more they printed, the less that money was worth. It was a spiral, a desperate attempt to bridge an impossible gap, but it only led to the destruction of our currency. The Rentenmark worked because it was different. It wasn't just more paper, it was backed by something real, by our land, by our industry. And crucially, the government promised to only issue a limited amount. But the biggest difference, the one you can't print on a banknote, was trust. People, starved for stability, desperate for something to believe in, put their faith in this new mark. And that, more than anything, is what gave it value. It was a fragile trust, born out of the ashes of absolute chaos. But it was enough to stop the bleeding. The scars, though, they ran deep. The confidence in banks, in the government, in the very idea of saving money for the future, it was shattered for my generation. How could you trust a system that had stolen everything you had, not with a thief's hand, but with a government's pen? I saw my father's lessons, the ones about thrift and security, turn to dust, and a new, unspoken lesson replaced them. Keep what you can hold. Keep what is real. Don't trust paper. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The factory started paying weekly again. We could buy bread, milk, even a small piece of meat on occasion, without rushing. Liesel eventually got new shoes, proper ones, not the heavy factory boots. Karl started to grow, slowly filling out his small frame. The hunger pangs became less frequent, then a memory. But the memory of those days, the sound of the wheelbarrow on the cobbles, the look in my children's hungry eyes, the taste of sorrow-soaked bread, it never truly left us. It left a caution in Greta's heart, a permanent tightness around her budgeting. It left a distrust in my own mind, a constant vigilance for any sign that the ground might start crumbling again. The immediate crisis was over. We had survived. But the cost was immeasurable. Not just in the billions of marks that vanished, but in the years of our lives, the erosion of our dreams, and the quiet, persistent fear that settled deep within our souls. We had paid the price of peace and the price of war, and we would never look at money or stability the same way again. We had been through the fire, and while we emerged, we carried the permanent marks of its burn. Years passed. The memory of the wheelbarrow, of the frantic daily dash, of the gnawing hunger, it never truly faded. But the immediate terror, the absurd, dizzying chaos of it all, slowly receded into the past. By the late 1920s, Germany had found a fragile new stability. The Rentenmark, a temporary bridge out of the madness, quickly gave way to the new Reichsmark in 1924. This new currency, backed by real assets, finally held its value. My wages, steady again, bought real things: bread, milk, coal for the stove, even new shoes for Liesel. The ceramic jar, the one for savings, it sat empty on the shelf for a long time. But eventually, Greta, ever the optimist, started putting a few coins in again. I often found myself holding a single Reichsmark coin in my palm, turning it over and over. It was heavy, metallic, solid, so different from the flimsy paper I'd pushed in that wheelbarrow. This coin represented hours of my work, weeks of my life, but it was finite, understandable. It was a tangible piece of trust, earned back slowly, painstakingly, from the ashes of unimaginable destruction. My children, Liesel and Karl, they grew up. Liesel, now a young woman, still held a quiet caution about spending, a habit ingrained by those hungry years. Karl, a strapping young man, understood the value of a good meal in a way others never could. They had lived through it, too. They learned the lessons in their bones. You see, for my generation, the mark was no longer just money. It was a scar, a reminder of how quickly everything can unravel. We had believed in the system, in the promise of paper, in the government. And that belief had been brutally betrayed. It left a permanent distrust in my heart. I'd watch the news, listen to the politicians, always with one ear cocked, listening for the faint, distant rumble of a printing press. Looking back now, with the clarity that time provides, the path to that madness seems so brutally clear. The Great War had bled us dry, costing billions we didn't have. Then came the Treaty of Versailles, demanding impossible reparations. And when France occupied the Ruhr, our government, in a desperate act of defiance and to support our striking workers, printed money to pay them. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't they just stop? Why keep printing more? Here's the thing, and it's a lesson you need to understand. They were trapped. Stop printing, and the government would collapse. Our industries would grind to a halt. Mass unemployment, starvation, chaos. Keep printing, and the currency would collapse. They chose to keep printing, hoping that somehow the situation would magically resolve itself. It never does. The more money they printed, the less each mark was worth. It was like adding more and more water to a small pool. The water was still there, but it was diluted, less potent. There were still the same goods, the same number of loaves of bread, liters of milk, pieces of coal. But suddenly, billions of pieces of paper were chasing them. Prices had nowhere to go but up. And once people realized their money was dying, they rushed to spend it immediately, making it die even faster. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy of worthlessness. It's a simple truth, really. Money, at its core, is just a promise. a promise that it can be exchanged for something real. When that promise is broken, when trust vanishes, money becomes nothing more than paper, or, as I learned, kindling. So, what do you take from a story like mine? What does this mean for you today? Well, the economic peace we found in the late 1920s was fragile. We enjoyed a few years of rebuilding, a brief exhale. But as you know, other storms were brewing, different kinds of storms, but ones that also fed on desperation and broken trust. The Great Depression would hit us hard just a few years later, and with it, new political turmoil that would plunge the world into darkness again. The lessons of hyperinflation, of what happens when a nation's economic bedrock crumbles, were not fully learned by everyone. Or perhaps they were learned too well by some, twisted into something monstrous. It's a warning to watch for the signs. When governments spend far beyond their means, when they print money without producing real wealth, when they lose the trust of their people, that's when the cracks begin to show. It might not be a wheelbarrow of cash for bread in your lifetime, but the underlying mechanisms, the erosion of value, the slow theft of your future. They are always the same. But it's also a story of resilience, of how ordinary people, like my family, faced down the impossible. We learned to adapt. We found ingenuity in desperation. My machinist skills, Greta's unwavering spirit, Liesel's clever hands, Carl's eagerness to help. These were the things that truly held value. We learned that community, helping a neighbor, sharing what little you had, could be a lifeline. That the true currency of survival wasn't paper, but human connection. We lost our savings, yes. We lost years of comfort, years of certainty, but we didn't lose our spirit. We learned that the most important things in life aren't numbers on a banknote, but the food on your table, the warmth in your home, and the people around you. We learned to cherish every single bite of bread, every flicker of fire, every moment of peace. My father's lessons about hard work and providing for your family, they never truly died. They just transformed. They became about more than just money. They became about resourcefulness, about community, about the enduring strength of the human spirit. You always are surprised what you're capable of when everything else is stripped away.